Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director at Denison Forum, sitting down for another conversation about faith and culture. Today, we're joined again by David French, who is an American political and cultural commentator, I would say, an attorney who has in the past argued high-profile cases, particularly in the area of religious liberty. And he has been a commentator and writer for National Review, as well as for The Atlantic, and more recently, in the last couple of years, has worked with The Dispatch, where I have followed him very diligently over the last number of years, and has recently been named as a columnist for the New York Times. Congratulations on that, David. We're looking forward to seeing you in that venue, and welcome to the Denison Forum podcast again.
Well, thanks so much for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, looking forward to a conversation. This is something that's been on my mind for a while, just following your writing, listening to a number of podcasts that you do through different avenues, but just wanted to have a conversation with you about Christians and power, how we understand power, how we relate to power. And let me just, if I could, kind of set a little bit of a context for you. Obviously, reading through the early pages of the Bible, we see the incredible, powerful hand of God creating all things, including creating human beings, placing them in the garden to exercise power, to manage and oversee all of God's creation. Then this terrible catastrophe, if you will, that is read about in Genesis 3, where sin and evil enter into the story. And then very soon after that, the abuse of power, where Cain takes out his anger, that really is an anger directed toward his disappointment with his relationship with God, takes that out on his brother, where we see the first murder. We see Cain kill his brother Abel, and the abuse of power. And we start seeing that. I think it's what led, I believe, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to say that that the core problem of all of our sin is the will to power. Let me just stop there and say, is that something you would agree with? Is that something that you've been a witness to?
I mean, I have seen the will to power lead to all kinds of sin. It's and often it's a most insidious kind of sin because the will to power is often accompanied by a firm conviction that justice can only be done if I attain power or if the person attains power. So they're going to rationalize this quest for power behind a veneer, or maybe they're even quite sincere about it, at least to start, of thinking, well, I can't do justice unless I have the power to do justice. So power has to sort of be the precursor. Power is the necessary precondition to an obligation to do justice. And then over time, what happens is power becomes not a precondition, it's just the thing. It becomes the object of a person's public life. And when that's the case, you begin to see and experience an enormous number of abuses. But that will to power is the root of many, many sins, and it's particularly seductive to people because they'll sort of whitewash it through this idea that I can only do justice if I have power.
And so, in that sense, power starts to become an idol of its own, right? It becomes an
Sure.
end in itself rather than a tool by which we might make a positive impact in the world for God and for His glory and for the good of others. It becomes an end in itself and something that
hmm
we desire to possess and then eagerly desire to hang on to whatever degree we have of it, right?
Right.
And when you particularly are talking about power in your work, and I know you have a number of opportunities to speak directly into the Christian community. When you're talking about power, uh, I know you obviously have background expertise in the area of political and legal power. What are you thinking of when you're trying to help Christians in particular to understand what we mean by power, whether we're talking political or economic? Is power the same thing as influence? How are you thinking
hmm
about that?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And I actually was thinking about the distinction between power and influence before we started talking. Um, in a way, influence is a form of power. It's a form of it represents an ability to change or alter outcomes as a result of your intervention. That would be what influence does. I think of it as in a different way than power, more direct power, which is really another word often for authority. Do I have the authority to uh, issue orders and have people carry out those orders? Do I have the authority to make policy? And influence, as you can imagine, is quite a bit different from that. Influence is more contingent. I might have your ear, I might have the ability to speak to you, but it's still going to be an exercise of your own decision making authority that executes your will. And I might influence it, but it is not. That is a. It's hard to say if that's a form of power. It's certainly a way in which Christians can alter the conditions under which they live through influence. But for a lot of folks, influence is not enough, because if you are an influencer, as much as people now covet that, like on Instagram,
Mm. Yeah.
if you're an influencer, there is still another link in the chain. And that link in the chain is the person with the actual power who exercises the actual authority. And even if you're a strong influencer, you're still depending on the will of another person. And I think that's one reason why some people feel frustrated that they quote unquote only influence. They would rather exercise power. And again, that gets us back to the seduction I talked about earlier, this idea that people are drawn to power, not just because it's intoxicating all on its own, but they have convinced themselves that their power is a necessary precondition to accomplish good things, to seek justice.
Mm. Let me kind of frame this a little bit from our context. One of the books of the last number of years that's been pretty influential for us at Denison Forum is a book written by James Davidson Hunter, a
Mhm.
sociologist at the University of Virginia, called To Change the World. And he makes the argument in part in this book that while it's great to build strong churches, it's important and significant to be involved in elections when you're in a country like ours. It's important to be involved in the community. He makes the argument that what Christians should be focused on is seeking their highest place of influence and living faithfully as believers in those contexts, what he calls the phrase manifesting faithful presence. Uh,
Mhm.
and in that conversation, what I'm wondering is power the actual position to be in a place, as you talked about, to make a decision and to say, this is the way it's going to be, this is how it's going to happen in this instance? Is power something that Christians actually ought to desire, that they ought to seek? Or is it something that they should just, if God puts them there, if God lets them walk into that situation, they should own it and steward it? Or is it should it be something that Christians desire at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. Another great question. When I think about what is our object, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? And this is Micah 6:8. That's the opening of Micah 6:8. It is to act justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with the Lord your God. And I think of those three interlocking obligations all the time. And notice what it says. It's your object is to act justly. In other words, your pursuit here is justice. Your pursuit isn't power. Your pursuit is justice. That's the core right there. Now, it's not your only pursuit. You're also to love kindness. So a lot of people are all about the pursuit of justice. They can tweet with extreme vigor about the issue of the day, or they're going to go to a protest, or they're going to vote, or they're going to argue on Facebook, or whatever they're going to do about the issue of the day. Act justly. But at the same time, they forget the other elements. Also, we are to love kindness, or other translations say love mercy. So, kindness slash mercy is not optional. It's not optional. And then the third one we often overlook because it often interferes with our ability to be a really decisive advocate, and that's walk humbly, to recognize that you don't have all of the answers. to understand complexity of issues that you're engaging in. And all of those things result in if you look in those three interlocking obligations and you hold them in harmony with each other, it really does adjust the way that you approach the public square. And what's not in that list is seek power, love kindness, walk humbly. It's act justly, love kindness, walk humbly. Now, I think that a Christian who is an extremely competent soldier should welcome the opportunity to be a general, right? If you are very, very good at what you do and you are pursuing excellence in your work, that the opportunity to have leadership authority and to exercise leadership authority, I don't think a Christian should shun that. But the object of your engagement isn't the power. The object of your engagement is defined by justice, by kindness, by humility. And I think that it's a very important distinction. And one of the things when you understand that obligation of acting justly, you really also begin to understand that in many ways, historically speaking, my personal power is not a precondition to acting justly or seeking justice. In fact, one of the most successful Christian justice movements in the whole history of the United States is the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And the people who instigated that movement had no power. They were not Martin Luther King wasn't running for president so that he could pass the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
He was a person who had no real political power, was engaging in acts of peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience as a way to seek justice from those who did possess power. And, was ultimately able to obtain enormous number of really important legal reforms. But the instigation for that was not, here, elect all of us president so we can do this. The instigation came through Christians without power who did not use their lack of power as an impediment to seeking justice or acting justly themselves. And it's just a different paradigm shift when you say, my priority is justice versus my priority is power. That's a paradigm shift. And you realize I don't have to have power to seek justice. Those are not, my ability to seek justice is not contingent on my personal authority.
Yeah, so it's an encouraging word for any person that listens to this podcast is to understand that there are elements of power that are available to us, even if we don't hold certain positions within the society or within the community.
Right.
Looking at Martin Luther King, going all the way back to the biblical era, going back to the birth of the early church, these early Christians had no standing. They had no
No.
positions of power that they had leverage in any way, but they still had the pursuit of justice and their own personal testimony and their own personal living out of a certain lifestyle that created power and accessed power and became influential in and of itself. And that's still available to every believer today, correct?
Right, absolutely. And let's not forget we have the example of Jesus who was specifically offered power and authority over the kingdoms of the earth during his temptations and said no to that. And said no to that to such an extent that he was actually crucified by the power and authority that existed at that time, unjustly, subject to unjust crucifixion. And so, right there, we have the example of the Son of God who had the ability to attain all power available on this earth and beyond, and specifically shunned it. And then we go to the New Testament, where the New Testament is not a guide for Christians to progress through the Roman bureaucracy. It is not a
Right.
guide for Christians to become leaders in the Roman Empire. It is a guide, in many ways, it's describing to Christians how to live faithfully in an atmosphere of persecution that is so grotesque that we can hardly even imagine it today. What we call as Christians persecution in the United States of America, a first century Christian would call a vacation for many of them.
Right.
And so we're in completely, we have so much more actual power and prosperity and wealth and influence than first century Christians could probably ever even imagine or conceive of. And yet we live our lives now feeling as if we're hanging on by our fingernails. When first century Christians would look at us and say, "Well, you've got it made. you We can't imagine a life like this." And so I think one of the things that we need to do, in addition to understanding sort of what is our object, is it's justice, not power. When you're talking about, what is it that we are to seek? Justice. There's no explicit command to seek power, and also to take a moment and kind of, for lack of a better term, chill out a bit with some historical perspective as to where we are in the United States of America and what kind of blessings that we actually enjoy. One thing that is very frustrating to me is the apocalyptic language of Christian political involvement, in in the American culture wars. It's really remarkable. And again, place that apocalyptic language. Say, if just imagine that a first century Christian is in front of you and you're repeating your talking points about apocalyptic challenges for Christians here in the United States, and they would be befuddled by it. They would be amazed by the power and authority of the church as it exists now. And again, that is not a call for us to just say, well, our job here is done, everything's fine for us here. No, there's a desperate need for to use to use sort of Lincoln-esque language of a more perfect union. There is a definite need for more justice in this land, for which we should be advocates. I am much more skeptical of the argument that more justice is equated with more people who call themselves Christians in positions of power. That's where I'm. I'm not necessarily on board with that notion.
So, yeah, so many directions that this could go. Recently, you wrote a piece that I was looking over that talks about, maturity, particularly maturity for us as Christians, is not just simply understanding the difference between right and wrong, but understanding how important a particular thing is. And
Right.
you start referencing apocalyptic language. It's like in some circles, it almost seems like anytime somebody picks up a topic, it becomes the absolute be all end all of the world from
Yeah.
their perspective, or at least the way that they want to have the conversation, seemingly putting or attempting to put their whole audience on edge and to create an activism that uh, really may not be warranted for the topic at hand. Now, obviously, we want to care about things that matter, but
Right.
we don't seem to have much nuance or discernment in our world, and even among Christians today, about, okay, this is important, but how important is it in the larger scheme of things? And I've heard you in various podcasts talk about this, is we're not setting things in their context very
Yes.
well. We just pull them out and set them on fire.
Yeah. Exactly. And here's why this happens. So if you look at the research about public engagement and attention in the United States of America, really a pretty small minority of people pay attention to politics on a routine daily basis. Let's put this in context. The most popular cable news host in America is Tucker Carlson, and he has a little over 3 million viewers every night. That's a lot of people. Well, there's about 330 million people in the United States of America. So on any given night, less than 1% of America is watching the most popular cable news host. If you add together all of the people watching cable news at a given point in time in the evening, it might be 5 or 6 million people. Again, out of a nation of 320, 330 million people. So you have a very small number of people percentage of people who really engage intentionally into politics. And so what ends up happening is those people are faced with a challenge. And that challenge is, well, how do I get more people to pay attention to my issue? Let's suppose it's free speech, or let's suppose it's school choice, or you name it. How do I sort of penetrate through the wall of apathy and indifference that a lot, or cynicism or skepticism, that the vast majority of people have, and towards politics or towards issues or towards activism. A lot of times they're just busy people. I mean, you've got kids going to 3 different practices, and you've got schooling, and you've got everything going on. You've got a sick aunt or an uncle. How do you penetrate through that? And the sort of most direct way of doing it is through this sort of fear mongering and apocalyptic language. It's like grabbing people by the lapels and shaking them. Pay attention to me. And how do you get them to pay attention? Again, it's the apocalyptic language. And it helps explain a phenomenon that I'm sure many of your listeners have experienced, and that is how many people have you known in your life that go from 0 to 100 on politics? In other words, maybe they didn't really care, and then they got red pilled, or they got woke, or whatever term you want to use, where they really got active and they really gained quote unquote awareness. And again and again, you'll see these people. It's not that they'll go from apathy to sort of reasoned conviction. They go from apathy to alarm. And in that case, you see this time and time again. And while an activist might say, our rhetoric worked, we got another ally, for the culture, it's all degrading the culture. Because again, it places us into this almost bifurcated world where there's a majority of people who don't really follow, who feel alienated, a minority of people who are extremely active, often extremely angry, and very little in between. And, one of the things that I urge is for folks not to be apathetic, but to be reasonably engaged. There is a spectrum between apathy and activism, and we should find the sweet spot. And we do need activists. Activists are often people who are absolutely expert in their field, and we do need different people engaging in different categories of work. But this idea that we can only activate through alarm, I think, has become incredibly degrading to our culture and incredibly divisive.
And David, do you think that there is some sense in which the culture generally is just getting exhausted with this? Because
Yes.
if 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 you're constantly sounding an alarm, right, it becomes the crying wolf syndrome of
Yes.
you're constantly ringing this alarm bell, trying to generate attention, and at some point, I as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking through family members that I'm thinking about who don't pay as much attention, even as much as attention as I do.
Yeah.
And, I'm more focused in these kinds of things than they ever want to be. They get tired of me talking about them. They get tired of me watching them or listening
Yeah.
to you and others, and I'm not even the biggest consumer by a long shot. Okay.
Right.
But in the last few years, as many, many others can say, I've seen family members who I couldn't have told you what their political persuasions or what their concerns were. And I've known these people for 30 or 40 years in many ways or longer. And they never had opinions until the last 3, 4, 5 years. And now
Yeah.
they have had, in some ways, rabid attention, which kind of goes to a question I wanted to ask you about the influence of technology
Mhm.
bringing in levels of awareness. But it is very much like what you're saying. We've seen a number of people go from 0 to 100
Yeah.
in their political awareness or uh, their public engagement. But I'm also thinking about, well, where are those people who are just living their lives? They're firemen, they're policemen, they're school
Yep.
teachers, they're moms, and they get caught up in it because of something that's on their television set or something that comes in their news feed, or they get caught up in it when they're standing in a conversation with somebody at work or school, and they're feeling like, well, I'm supposed to have an opinion. I guess I better get an opinion, or I'm going to look stupid or left out here. What's your advice to them about how how aware should they be? Where do you go to find that sweet spot on that continuum?
Yeah, that's a really good, hard question. So what we're seeing is two things playing out at once: a process of radicalization and alienization. So the radicalization you just described, which is the person you know in your family who hasn't really paid attention to politics for 20, 30 years that you've known them, and then all of a sudden they're up on all of it. They know about all the Twitter beefs, they know about all of the controversies about vaccines or about religious liberty or about abortion or whatever you want the topic to be. They're all about it. Race, CRT, they're all about it. And that's the radicalization process. The alienization process is less visible because the intention when you're alienated is to be invisible. It's if you've seen the old gif of Homer Simpson walking into the shrubbery and disappearing, walking backwards into the shrubbery and disappearing, that's what a lot of us are doing with politics. Is you're walking backwards into the shrubbery and saying, I don't want any piece of this, because you know that if you offer an opinion on Facebook, even if you're not a public figure, you might have somebody in your life just come after you. And you don't want that in your life. You don't need that. So you'll back away. And these people become essentially invisible in the public square because they're not participating. And what's happening is what we're seeing is a very toxic development where political participation in the US right now is narrowing in some important ways, not in the sense of voting. Voting is becoming more broad because more people are, because as politics becomes more contentious, more people will make time to get to the polls. But I'm talking about that day to day activism and engagement. It's narrowing and intensifying. And so, why would I say that? If you look at just the web traffic from the last from November of 2022 to the let's just pull out like the top 20 right wing conservative news sites online. Of that top 20, only 2 experienced positive audience growth over the last year. 18 of them experienced negative growth, and for some of them, they experienced extremely significant negative growth. I'm talking losses of audience of in the 61% range, 70%, 68%, 45%. Just a really remarkable shrinking of audience participation. But you wouldn't know it by the intensity of what they say. It's every bit as intense as it's been. Sometimes it's more intense. And so what ends up happening is those people who are getting engaged on a day-to-day basis, there's fewer of them, but they're angrier. And the angrier they get, the more they alienate people and the fewer activists there are. And so it's kind of a vicious cycle. And so one of the things I think that's really important is that exhausted majority, those are the people who shrink into the bushes, have to become empowered. In other words, look, you cannot leave the political field to the angriest voices in American life. You just can't do it. You're going to end up, especially in primaries, you're going to end up with incredibly fringe or unsatisfactory candidates. You saw that in the Republican Party in the 2022 election cycle. Um, Party primaries yielded extreme candidates who couldn't win general elections. So engaging is very, very important for culture change in our political discourse. And that culture change is necessary right now. It's necessary to move us off of escalating commitments to extremism and back towards a notion of dialogue, true and productive debate, and reasonable engagement. Because we can't live in a world where there's the hyper engaged and the apathetic majority, and the apathetic majority only makes its will felt once every 2 years when it gets into the voting booth, and then leaves the field to the the activist minority for the rest of the time. So there has to be a firm conviction of reasonable engagement.
So, do you feel like, are you seeing any hopeful signs on two sides of this? One is that reasonable, mostly silent majority who may at this point be retreating from their attention just because they've been worn out by so many
because
things.
it's
They're
so
worn
nasty.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see any hopeful signs that reasonable majority that we believe is out there, that we absolutely really have to continue on as a healthy democracy? Do you see that group is going to engage in the most healthy and reasonable ways? And then the flip side of that, those that are actually going to want to run for office, whether that's, school board, even in the community where I live, being a school board member right now is kind of a dangerous job,
Oh,
and has
yeah.
become even more thankless than it ever was. It was always thankless, and hard work done by people volunteering their good effort and intention, and now they get blistered in ways they never. And so the other side of it
Yeah.
is people, those reasonable, good intentioned people who simply want to do good and seek justice, even at the local level, stepping out and saying, you know what, if this is going to get better, it has to have some healthy people involved in it, and
Yes.
I'm willing to be one of them. Do you see that coming back around, or are we still going to be in a season for maybe even a prolonged time of that reasonable majority and candidates retreating, leaving the field to the extremists?
I'm worried that we're going to be wandering in this wilderness a bit longer. I have, you brought up school board. My brother-in-law is on the local school board. He's Christian. He's conservative. And I live in a heavily conservative county, vast majority evangelical county, especially in the voting population. And he had to have security. He had to have security because of other Christian conservatives who didn't believe he was conservative enough. And so he had to have security. I mean, that is dysfunctional. That is gross. The idea that people in the name of Jesus are so angry that they cause other Christians to fear for their physical safety when they engage in politics. That's disturbing. And the problem you have is then you have a series of individual decisions that make a ton of sense individually, but collectively really hurt us. The decision that makes sense individually is to say, I don't need that in my life. I don't need to be on the school board, or I don't need to engage in this. I don't need to experience that level of conflict. I just don't need it. I remember I was talking to a Republican doctor not long ago, and he said, you know what? He's a great guy, just awesome, salt of the earth guy. And he said, after January 6th, he unplugged from politics. He just left it. He said, no more social media, no more conversations about it. And you know what? I'm a better husband. I'm a better father. My blood pressure is down. It's so good that's not in my life. And I had two thoughts at the same time. Good for you, bad for us.
Mm.
Good for you. I'm glad your life is better. Bad for us because we need reasonable people like you in American politics. And reasonable does not mean milk toast. A reasonable person needs to have firm convictions when firm conviction is warranted, but a reasonable person also realizes that compromise is sometimes necessary. Reasonable people also don't believe that one side or the other has a monopoly on truth. Um, Reasonable people know that one side or the other does not have a monopoly on malicious actors or bad actors. And so, that individual decision that makes sense is just sort of another brick in the wall of apathy that really hurts us in the long run. And there's not a really great path by it. I use a Harry Potter analogy, forgive me. Harry Potter was known as the boy who lived because Voldemort tried to kill him and couldn't kill him. And what we need are more and more politicians who stand up for reasoned positions, who, for lack of a better term, live politically, who prosper politically, and that who are able to navigate past the highly toxic, highly negatively partisan world and still maintain a sense of reason and conviction and compassion and kindness and humility. The more people we have like that who do well, who prosper, the more others, I think, will feel encouraged to run for office. Conversely, the more people who have no ethics, who have no true, who have no integrity, who win and maintain power, that is discouraging to virtue. That is discouraging to reasonable people. And, it's one of the reasons why things like having accountability for a George Santos, who appears to be, if that's even his name, appears to be a total fraud, a
Yeah.
total fraud. And the answer so far from the House GOP is, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to
Yeah.
do? And so, that is deeply discouraging to virtue when you see vice rewarded in that way. And so all of this stuff is very hard. All of this stuff is very hard because it's asking normal, reasonable people to endure a degree of unpleasantness or even hardship for the sake of restoring restoring reason to our political culture, which feels like a really big ask that you really can't change yourself. And then I'm asking you to incur the wrath of Uncle Milt to do
Yeah.
that. It's hard. It's hard. So you see why the rational decision that so many people make is just a step away.
Which really comes back to that whole issue that Christians have to really dedicate themselves to asking God, where do you want me to be
Right.
involved? And
Right.
to have our founder CEO Jim Dennison talks about this often, that uh, there has to be a sense of calling, that God, you want me to do this, not because it's going to be all fun and games and it's going to be easy, but because if our world is going to be better, and that's really, I think, the reason why somebody would run for the school board, right?
Right.
If that's the first level, is, well, who's going to make it good for my kid? My
Right.
pastor used to say is, hey, look, if you live in a great community with great schools and great organizations, you need to be thankful somebody came ahead of you and made it great, and now somebody has to pick it up and continue to help it to be great. And it really, for those that are going to listen to this podcast, will you pray about where does God want you to be involved? And we would all hope that would be within your church, but also within your community. Where can you be involved? And I've heard you and others talk about this on a real important basis. Is your greatest level of impact is in the proximity right outside your front door, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's sort of, it's almost like a formula that you can have a large amount of influence over a small number of people and very little influence over a large number of people. And where do you have your influence? Where do you have, obviously, within the walls of your own home, within your extended family? These are places where and then in your community, and it sort of radiates out and diminishes from there. And what I have seen is amongst a lot of people get super polarized now. They end up being angry about a lot of things that they have no control over at all. They are projecting all of their energy and effort into worlds where they have microscopic levels of influence and authority. But
It's kind of like we've. I think I've heard you use this phrase before. Somebody did. We've nationalized every issue and
everything,
brought it to the local level. You
yeah,
know,
yeah. Like if you're running for school board in Williamson County, Tennessee, where I live, to stop critical race theory, well, that's a national dispute that doesn't really have any bearing here. We don't have CRT in local schools in Williamson County, Tennessee. It's just not there. And so if you're running because you saw on Fox News that CRT is a problem, well, you've nationalized a local controversy. Well, you've brought a national controversy to a locality where that controversy did not previously exist. And that's a very unproductive way of engaging. A much more productive way of engaging is to take your community for what it is. What is here? What is it that is the issue here, and engage with that issue here, not as a foot soldier in a larger national army about an issue that doesn't have any local relevance. And so I think that that's one of the things that we've seen is this nationalization of local engagement with the hopes that you can make Fox News maybe, or the hopes that you can be some sort of role player in this big national conversation. And it creates an enormous amount of angst. I was talking to an older gentleman the other day, and every time I run into him, he brings up the border. He wants to know about the border. And I explained to him what I know about what can be done, what is being done, my understandings of the problems. But it's really dominant in this gentleman's mind. And finally I said, have you considered turning off Fox News, at least many, not all every night, but at least most nights? You belong to a church, you have a wonderful family, you have grandchildren who love you. The border should not be the dominant thought in your mind. Yeah, you should be an informed citizen, but the border should not be the thing that is dominating your waking thoughts. And how many of us, though, know people, and I don't want to say exclusively, but often in the old ranks of older Americans who are spending their golden years with their minds captured by national political controversies over which they have very little to no influence. And it's creating toxic environments within families, it's creating toxic environments within political parties. And again, I'm not saying don't pay any attention to the news. I'm saying reasonable engagement. And that's the key, because a lot of the science right now tells us the more people engage with the news, the more wrong they are about their political opponents. The more news they watch, the more they misjudge their political opponents, because they've been fed a constant cycle of warnings about the other side's extremism.
So, David, you work in this space, and so help us with one of the questions we probably get more frequently than any other question, which is, okay, can we or can we not trust any of the media that's coming to us? Journalists have found their way to the bottom of the rung, apparently, in the same way that used car salesmen are commonly talked about. Uh, no offense meant here. Sometimes the way attorneys are talked about
Yeah.
now in our world, kind of the way preachers like me are talked about. Now journalists have kind of found their way to the bottom with us, which is
Yeah.
you just can't trust any of them. And the number one question we get asked, I got asked this on an airplane coming back from Israel 10 days ago, is okay, I've got high school and college age children, and I'm trying to help them to know how to be well informed, but not alarmed in an unreasonable way. I want them to be aware of the world. I want them to find their place in the world. I want them to have a redemptive influence in the world. How do I help them as well as myself know where to be well informed about what's going on both locally, but also nationally and globally? The pandemic's taught us anything. It's taught
Yeah.
us that we are connected more around the world. I've seen this in my own children, my own adult children. They look at airplanes like they're taxi cabs, and the world is a neighborhood, which is good in many ways. But how do you help? How would you counsel your own children to be well informed but not alarmed?
So the first thing I say to people often when they ask me, well, where should I go? Which news source can I trust? And my first answer is not any one news source. Because the first thing that we have to, when there's a thing we have to realize about journalism. Journalism has two huge challenges that are presented to it. One is it's comprised of human beings. So you take whatever industry that exists. I don't care if it's insurance agents, journalists, McDonald's managers, assembly line workers. You're going to find a full range of people there. Some are going to be honorable, high integrity. Some are going to be hyper competent. Some of them are not. So you're going to have an industry that is full of people, many of whom are great, many of whom are not. And they have a specific job. And one of their jobs is, it's one of the hardest jobs that exists on the planet. And it is write the first draft of history as it unfolds. Okay. That is, people have to understand how difficult that is. When I served there's this concept called the fog of war. And when I served in Iraq, it was sometimes difficult to know exactly what was happening 1 mile away with a group, a small, a patrol of 3 vehicles involved in a firefight that involved less than 2 dozen people total. It was sometimes difficult to discern what happened, completely discern what happened for days. For days. Well, what a journalist is trying to do is describe what's happening in the world and in the United States every day as it unfolds. And that's really difficult. And so you're absolutely going to get some things wrong. Absolutely. You don't have a God's eye view. And often you're trying to figure out events that are occurring and you're trying to figure out the truth when an awful lot of people don't want you to know the truth. So you have to overcome resistance to even get to the truth. So what that means is there is not going to be such thing as, well, this is the news source you go to and they're going to always have it. No, what you do is you have to find a variety, a small number, but a small number of news sources that you have experienced as operating in good faith who hold themselves accountable for mistakes. So here's a good rule of thumb. If you read a publication and you find out that they don't offer corrections when they've been called out as wrong, that you find out that they're overwhelmingly in the business of opinion rather than reporting, don't go there as your first source of what's happening. Their perspective might be valuable at some point, but to discern what is happening, go to outlets, regardless of their political lean, that correct mistakes, hold themselves and others accountable for mistakes. That's where you go. And the one thing I also say is maintain read a variety of sources. Don't just say, okay, well, the New York Times has the most well-funded reporting. I'm going to New York Times. No, also read the Wall Street Journal. Also read the Washington Post. You can't devour them all every day, but to really understand, you need to read multiple outlets. And here's the other thing is 100% absolutely do not wall yourself off ideologically. If you're a conservative, if you don't regularly read more progressive outlets, you're doing it wrong. If you're progressive and you don't regularly read the better conservative outlets, you're doing it wrong. Because you will end up mainlining your own Kool-Aid if all you do is read sites or read people who agree with you. And then there's this one other thing. If you hear about a new idea, try to learn about the new idea from the proponents of the idea before you learn about it from its opponents. Treat yourself like a jury. A jury hears from a prosecutor and then hears from the defense. It hears from the plaintiff and it hears from the defense. Here's what we often do if we hear about something we didn't know about before. Let's say it's critical race theory, to use something that we've talked about. We'll say, who is the conservative that I trust to describe critical race theory to me? Well, that's not it. Go read somebody who's an actual critical race theorist, then read the conservative critique of it. And similarly, if you hear of a new conservative idea and you're a progressive, let's say you've been adamantly opposed to school choice. Have you ever read a proponent, a supporter of school choice's arguments? Or have you only read a progressive activist debunking? Well, you're not going to get a full picture. And so I think a lot of this is we just really do need to think of ourselves kind of like judges or jurors, where we hear from both sides and make determinations. We don't decide, I'm a conservative, therefore my news sources are conservative, or I'm a progressive, therefore my news sources are progressive. That is the kiss of polarization right there. That is when you're going to start walking down a dark path.
Do you let me get your reaction to this? If there was any one thing I could change about journalism on a broad spectrum within our country, it would be this. It would be that every one of those outlets, every one of those sources would declare their primary perspective, because it seems like they want to offer you both reporting and opinion, um, but not tell you what their own set of, uh, if you want to say, biases are. And so other people, there's entities now that have taken up that work of saying, okay, well, this source is generally left, this source is generally right, this one is far right, this one is far left. There's some people doing that work now. Is there any value in your opinion where a news source would at some way on a regular basis say this is kind of where we come at things from, or is that just
Ah,
unreasonable to ask for?
so I think there's a problem with that, and it's this. Good news outlets separate reporting and opinion. In other words, they silo them so that
Right.
the opinion side is explicitly biased. Like the editorial board of a mainstream newspaper is going to have opinions that it announces. And what ends up happening is you'll have a lot of people who kind of honestly in bad faith conflate the two. So I have seen this happen on media and media all the time. They'll say the New York Times said, and what they mean is a columnist for the New York Times offered his or her opinion. That's not the New York Times speaking, that is the columnist offering their opinion. And then when you do it like that, and then you hear the New York Times reported, and it's a news report, often that you're starting to conflate these two things. Wait, the New York Times, they're the people who just said that Dobbs is wrongly decided, and now they're reporting that, well, wait, it's two separate entities. It's the opinion side and it's the reporting side. And this is a traditional separation. One of the reasons why, sadly, the conservative world is not as familiar with that phenomenon is right wing media is by and large opinion media. Um, Fox is different. Fox has a hard news side and it has an opinion side, but most people encounter Fox through the opinion side. That's not the primetime programming, right? Um, but a lot of right wing media, I could go down the list of top 20 media sites. And of those top 20, only Fox really has a super well defined, clearly large scale reporting operation that is arguably larger than the opinion side. All of the rest of them are much more opinion driven outlets. And so that's acculturated an awful lot of people on the right to think of, well, my news outlet has an attitude because it does. If you're Because it does. Well, if you're reading the New York Times, the story of Russian advances outside of Bakhmut is reported and edited through a chain of command that is entirely different from, say, the Thomas Friedman opinion column about what Russian advances in Bakhmut mean. And so that's where a lot of people get off kilter and off track as they read the opinion side and impute that to the reporting side. And well functioning organizations separate those things. And so for me, I don't care if a national security reporter voted Democrat or Republican. I care about, are their reports accurate? And I feel like for some of them, if you say, Jane Smith, a Democrat, reporting from the Pentagon for the New York Times, it gives a lot of bad faith operators a chance to say, oh, don't listen to her. She's a Democrat. When the reporting and opinion are different things. And I feel like a lot of folks on sort of our side, the right side of the spectrum, have been conditioned by the media that is developed in the right wing world to see media as shot through with opinion in all categories, in all areas. And for well functioning outlets, that's not the case.
And I don't think we have much much of an understanding or appreciation of what it would be like to live in a country that did not have a free press.
Right.
Because we've become so saturated with news, and especially on the right. I wouldn't say that exclusively.
Mm,
You and I certainly would probably definitely find ourselves on the evangelical right,
yeah.
but we uh, we have become convinced that everything is simply opinion rather than
Right.
really quality journalistic news reporting. And that's really what I take out of your comment. Is the first thing is okay, let's distinguish between reporting the news as best we can,
Mhm.
which is hard in and of itself. Somebody is trying to report this happened, and here's at least the initial set of facts as we know them today. We're going to have to continue to add to the story because all stories are complicated, especially big stories. But here's the first draft of history, and we're just trying to give you this happened in the world. And
Yeah.
then the separate category is opinion. Okay. And first question is, which one are we talking about? What thing are we dealing with? A news story or an opinion? That's first thing. But we have to come to a historical perspective and appreciation of the value of having a free press and the oppression that happens even in our world today in places that don't experience a free press.
Mhm.
And we don't have much of that perspective right now.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. So I'm looking at the New York Times homepage right now, and on the top story is a helicopter crash in Ukraine kills at least 14, including cabinet minister. This is classic. History is unfolding before us. The very first part of it says there were no initial signs had been shot down. What does that mean? Does it mean it wasn't shot down? No. Does it mean it crashed on its own? No. It just says there are no initial signs that it had been shot down. That's classic news reporting. Then you go to the right side of the page and you see clearly opinion. And under the opinion, you might have a story like nurses are burned out and fed up for good reason. That's taking news events, analyzing them, and offering a take on the news. And then there's another category that's just sort of what you might call pure just analysis. Here's what's happening. Here's what I think it means versus here's what's happening versus what I think it should mean. So in other words, an active analysis, which is involved with opinion, would be what are the Russians' chances of taking Bakhmut? That's analysis, but it's not necessarily ideological. You're just trying to figure out, does the Russian military have the strength to take it? And so you can see all of this is rather complicated, and it's way too complex to just sort of say, well, there are these writers at the New York Times I really don't like, therefore I'm not going to trust the New York Times. But I hear stuff like that all the time, and I'm not just defending my future employer. I'm saying we have to be sophisticated in how we're able to evaluate what we're reading. Is this a reporting? Is this analysis? Is this commentary? And judge accordingly.
Okay. Let me get you to just close out with reaction to one last comment, and that is, um, give me your take on uh, the need for Christians to see themselves less as cultural warriors and more as cultural missionaries.
Oh, I like that. I like that. One of the things that I think of all the time is that the fruit of the Spirit is not optional in any context. In other words,
Right.
it is not a situation where kindness, gentleness, self-control, etc. should be we should do exhibit those virtues unless they don't work. In other words, unless that means that we might lose a political race or we might lose a
Or the
promotion.
or the topic is so extreme we have to set that aside.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
if you are obedient in doing your best to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit, you are going to be a cultural missionary. You are going to be countercultural. You are. One of the problems we have now is that a lot of Christians are not countercultural at all in the way in which they engage in politics. They might be countercultural on the issue. In other words, they might be pro life, and that's countercultural, or they might be pro religious liberty, and that's countercultural, but they're not countercultural in the way in which they conduct politics. They're just like the world, sometimes harsher and worse. And so, what we have to do, and we have to realize A, that's just disobedient. B, it's repulsive to an awful lot of people. And C, it is inconsistent with what we understand about the example of Jesus and the example of the apostles. And, Paul is and Jesus are living in times when there was extreme persecution, extreme oppression, and yet the message was bless those who persecute you, pray for your enemies, um, love your enemies. you know,
Yeah.
and sadly, we view ourselves now more countercultural on issues. and not as much on the way in which we interact with people we disagree.
Yeah. And Christians just have to get clarity and commitment around the idea that the end never justifies the means.
Right, exactly.
It just, we talk about it theoretically, we can say it verbally, but this is where it really comes down to it is, are you loving justice, but are you also loving mercy
Mhm.
while you're walking humbly with God, as you talked about earlier? If you're not putting those three things together, then you're not
You're
getting
doing
it
it
right.
wrong. Yeah, you're doing it
And
wrong.
and that's what I point people to the example of Daniel as another
Mhm.
example. Daniel's living in an oppressive situation, but he believes that there is a right way to be right. And if you're not being right the right way, then you're not being right.
Yeah, yeah.
And and Christians need to learn that when they step out their front door, regardless of how big their public life might be.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter. It always needs to be in that context.
Yes.
Yeah. David, thank you for your time today. Thank you for spending some time with us. We hope to get to do it again soon.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
All right. Take care. God bless.